Hello and welcome to Byju's IAS. Let's take up the analysis of today's The Hindu newspaper. Today we have 3 articles on the editorial page, that is on page number 6, that deal with the topic of contempt of court. So let us club all these articles together and take a look at this important topic. See, when you are held in contempt of court, it basically means that you have committed an offense against the court, particularly against the dignity and the authority of the court. This offense has been defined under the Contempt of Courts Act of 1971. Contempt of court is nothing but showing disrespect to the authority of the court and disobeying the orders of the court. Such acts are seen to lower the dignity and the authority of the court, and it reduces the reputation of the court in the eyes of the public, thus affecting public confidence in the judiciary. Now, in a constitutional democracy, public confidence in the judiciary is of utmost importance because judiciary, being one of the 3 pillars of a constitutional democracy, it is seen as the final interpreter of the constitution and the law of the land, and it is seen as the protector of the citizens' fundamental rights. The judiciary plays a key role in keeping the powers of the legislature and the executive under check, and it prevents them from violating the fundamental rights of the citizens. The judiciary is also seen as the guardian of key constitutional principles such as justice, equality, and liberty. So, in such a constitutional setup, public faith and public confidence in the judiciary is seen to be absolutely essential. So, in this regard, any act that disrespects the dignity of the court and disobeys the authority of the court is treated as an offense, and it is held to be in contempt of court. So, in such cases, contempt of court proceedings are initiated against the individual or the organization who might have disrespected or disobeyed the court. Under the 1971 Act, contempt of court is divided into civil contempt and criminal contempt. Civil contempt basically refers to willful disobedience of the court's orders. That is the refusal or the failure to implement the court's orders. Usually, civil contempt proceedings are initiated against government officials such as IAS officers, private organizations, and even against individuals who willfully disobey the orders of the court or who fail to implement the orders of the court. Then criminal contempt proceedings are initiated against someone who tries to scandalize the court by making unfair allegations that leads to the lowering of the authority of the court and the reputation of the court in the eyes of the public. So scandalizing could refer to unsubstantiated allegations of corruption against the judges or allegations of favoritism, sexual harassment, etc. Then criminal contempt proceedings can be initiated against someone who tries to disrupt or interfere with judicial proceedings. It can also be initiated against someone who tries to obstruct the administration of justice. So under the Act, those who are held guilty of civil contempt can be punished by the judiciary by imposing fines and penalties against them, and those who are held guilty of criminal contempt can be punished with imprisonment and as well as with fines and penalties. So this is an extraordinary power and privilege that is available to the judiciary to protect its dignity and authority in order to help retain public confidence and public faith in the judiciary. But time and again it has been observed that serious issues and lapses have emerged in the application of contempt of court proceedings. Courts have often initiated contempt of court proceedings subjectively, and in its hurry to protect the dignity and authority of the court and the reputation of the court, it has ended up targeting freedom of speech of those who have some constructive criticism to offer about the functioning of the judiciary. This reactive approach of the court has always been a subject of discussion, and it leads to the dilution of judicial accountability. See, in today's world of social media, a number of experts and commentators tend to freely criticize the judiciary for its flaws and lapses. But in every such case, if the court pushes for contempt proceedings, then it only highlights the reactive approach of the judiciary, which threatens freedom of speech and leads to the dilution of judicial accountability. See, there is no doubt that in certain cases, contempt proceedings have to be initiated by the court in order to protect its dignity and authority. Let's say, for example, a government official has willfully disobeyed the orders of the court. Then in such cases, contempt proceedings have to be initiated in order to bring the government officials in line, and this is essential to protect the authority of the court. Similarly, if an individual or an organization, if they have unnecessarily interfered with judicial proceedings, if they are trying to obstruct the administration of justice, then in such cases, contempt proceedings have to be initiated in order to protect the court's reputation and restore public faith and public confidence. But courts will have to tread very carefully when it comes to the application of contempt proceedings in cases that deal with scandalizing the court. See, if unfair and unnecessary allegations are being made against the judiciary, such as charges of corruption, unsubstantiated charges of sexual harassment, or if overt threats are being issued to the judges, then in such cases, criminal contempt proceedings will have to be initiated by the court. But if a legal expert or a journalist or a commentator, if he or she is offering any constructive criticism, and if the court treats this as contempt, then it only shows the reactive approach of the court and the misuse of contempt provisions. Let's say a legal expert is criticizing the flaws in the collegium system of appointments, or a journalist is highlighting the backlog or the pendency in cases, or if activists are calling for judicial reforms, or when they are raising substantiated charges of corruption against the judiciary. In all such cases, the judiciary should not resort to the option of contempt and should not invoke the dignity and authority of the court. By doing so, the court will only show its reactive approach, and it not only highlights the subjective application of contempt proceedings, but it also highlights the stifling of freedom of speech by the judiciary itself. The fear of inviting contempt proceedings will push journalists and the public to stop questioning the judiciary, and it takes away constructive criticism, which could lead to the dilution of judicial accountability and judicial reforms. So it is in this context that the editorial says, it is time to revisit the idea of scandalizing in contempt law in order to usher in judicial accountability. A similar argument has been made in two columns on page number 6 as well. In this column, the writer says that the misuse and subjective application of criminal contempt has a chilling effect, and it is regrettable that judges believe that silencing criticism will harbor respect for the judiciary. In the other column, the writer says that in contempt of court cases, one must tread carefully or not at all, because there are questions for the judiciary as well. Now let's take up another editorial from page number 6, which deals with the office of the governor. See, the governor is a constitutional authority that has been provided under Article 153 to Article 162 of the Indian Constitution. The governor of a state functions as the constitutional head of the state, and he plays a key role in the governance of the state and as well as in maintaining political stability in the state. As a result of the constitutional duties that have been placed on the governor, he functions as a crucial link between the central government and the state government. Through the office of the President of India, he acts as the representative of the central government and forms a crucial link in the chain of administration. But time and again it has emerged that the office of the governor has been misused by the ruling party at the center to destabilize state governments that are ruled by opposition parties. Such misuse of the office of the governor has led critics, various committees, and even the Supreme Court to label the governor as an agent of the center. See, the latest issue concerning the office of the governor is being seen in Rajasthan with regard to the ongoing political crisis in the state. As rebel MLAs have expressed their sense of no confidence in the government, the stability of the state government has come under question. But the Chief Minister of the state has claimed that he has the necessary numbers to prove his majority, and hence he has asked the governor to call for an immediate floor test. That is, for a test of confidence on the floor of the House. But despite this advice of the Chief Minister, who heads the Council of Ministers, the Rajasthan governor has failed to summon the session, and he has been delaying the floor test. This leads to allegations that the delay is intended to buy time to the opposition BJP to indulge in horse trading in order to bring down the democratically elected state government. This delay on the part of the Rajasthan governor to call for a floor test, despite the advice of the Council of Ministers, goes against previous rulings of the Supreme Court. Because in several cases, the Supreme Court has made it very clear that when it comes to summoning an assembly session, the governor of the state does not enjoy any discretionary powers. In fact, as mandated by the Constitution, the governor is bound by the aid and advice of the Council of Ministers, and when the Chief Minister advises the governor to summon a session, he is bound to do so, and he is bound to call for a floor test. But however, when the governor feels that the government does not enjoy the confidence of the assembly, in such cases, the democratic due process is to summon a session and conduct a floor test in order to give an opportunity to the chief minister and state government to prove their majority on the floor of the house. But in the case of Rajasthan, the governor delaying the floor test by citing several reasons does not stand the test of the constitution and judicial scrutiny. But in contrast to the delay in Rajasthan for holding a floor test, just a few months ago in Madhya Pradesh, we saw that the governor of the state was in a hurry to call for a floor test without providing for ample opportunities for the incumbent government, because it was quite clear that the opposition party which is in power at the center had a comfortable majority which could help it sail through any floor test. So such contradicting behaviors of governors when the political stability of the state government is in question, and such blatant breach of constitutional norms and democratic propriety has led several critics, several committees and even the Supreme Court to label the office of the governor as an agent of the centre. Today, if it is the BJP which is seen to be misusing the office of the governor to topple state governments, back in the 1960s and 1990s, it was the Congress which was infamous for using the office of the governor to topple several state governments. In the recent past itself, we have seen several instances where the central government has misused the office of the governor to destabilize several state governments. Be it Maharashtra, be it Madhya Pradesh, be it Karnataka or Manipur, there have been several instances where the governor's office has been misused to destabilize the political governments in order to bring the opposition party to power. The same trend was witnessed between the 1960s and 1990s when the Congress was in power at the center, and the governor's office has been misused time and again because as a constitutional authority and as the constitutional head of the state, the governor plays a key role with regard to imposition of president's rule in the state, when there is a hung assembly after state elections, and when questions of no confidence has arisen. And in such cases of constitutional crisis, it has been noticed time and again that the governor, through his partisanal and biased behavior, has always favored the ruling party at the central government. The same observations have been brought out by several committees as well, including the first Administrative Reforms Commission, the second ARC, the Sarkaria Commission on Centre-State Relations, the Punchi Commission, and more importantly by the Supreme Court in the landmark SR Bommai case. All these committees and even the Supreme Court have laid down several guidelines for the central government in order to prevent the misuse of the office of the governor, but the failure to abide by these guidelines and implement these guidelines has turned the office of the governor into an agent of the centre. Now let's take up a column from page number 7 that evaluates the controversial national security law passed by China that undermines Hong Kong's autonomy. See, we have covered the background to this topic in detail on several occasions, including on the 28th of May. The controversial national security law passed by China applies to the special administrative region of Hong Kong. See, to understand why this law is controversial, you need to look at the colonial past of Hong Kong. Until 1997, Hong Kong remained a British colony. In 1984, both China and Britain had signed an agreement. Through this declaration, Britain declared that colonialism in Hong Kong would come to an end in 1997, and the Hong Kong region would fall under the territorial sovereignty of China or the People's Republic of China. But in order to establish Hong Kong as a democratic region, in contrast to communist China, Britain mandated China to provide for a one country, two system model, and this was a commitment that China agreed to under the Sino-British Joint Declaration, and this was supposed to grant Hong Kong limited autonomy through its own mini constitution known as the Basic Law, which is operative from 1997 until 2047. It is this Basic Law that sets Hong Kong apart from China, and even though communist China enjoys territorial sovereignty over Hong Kong, the special administrative region of Hong Kong has been established as a democratic region which enjoys limited autonomy from the PRC. It is this model of one country, two systems that enabled the special administrative region of Hong Kong to provide for fundamental rights and human rights to its citizens. So in a way, the Basic Law marked the end of colonialism, and it gave birth to Hong Kong as a modern democratic region. But over the last few years, This limited autonomy that Hong Kong enjoyed has been brought under severe threat by the PRC. In 2019, the pro-China camp in the Hong Kong administration proposed the introduction of an extradition law which would allow the residents of Hong Kong to be extradited to mainland China, especially in cases involving national security. So the pro-democracy camp in Hong Kong saw this as an attempt to undermine the fundamental rights and human rights of the citizens and residents of Hong Kong, and this led to the breakout of massive pro-democracy protests last year. These protests continued for months together before it was brought to an abrupt halt by the COVID-19 pandemic. But as the pro-China camp was gaining strength and as the pro-democracy movement was weakening, the Chinese government introduced the controversial national security law, which seeks to undermine the basic law or the mini constitution of Hong Kong. The problem with the national security law is that it allows Chinese security and intelligence agencies that have jurisdiction only over mainland China to extend their jurisdiction over the autonomous Hong Kong region as well, and it enables the mainland Chinese agencies to work with the Hong Kong police and to carry out joint investigation and even to advise the local police. So this law basically allows mainland China to call the shots in cases related to national security, criminal investigation, etc. And this has the potential to severely undermine the fundamental rights and human rights of the citizens and residents of Hong Kong. Hence, the writers of this column argue that the national security law has turned Hong Kong into a colonial city again. Back then, if it was the British who were the imperial power, now it is the PRC which is seeking to undermine the fundamental rights and human rights guaranteed under the basic law through its autocratic laws. Now let's take up another column from page number 7. According to the writers of this column, the COVID-19 pandemic has derailed our march towards the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations. We know that the pandemic and the country-wide lockdowns that followed around the world has pushed millions of people into poverty, and it has exposed the weakness and the fragility of our socio-economic welfare system. The pandemic has exposed the weakness in our healthcare system. It has exposed the lack of coverage of our social security measures. It has also exposed the weak financial support and credit support given to small industries, especially the MSME sector. But however, the pandemic and the lockdowns have pushed a number of governments around the world to adapt and to innovate by expanding their welfare programs. Including India, a number of countries have expanded the scope of their food security schemes. They have diverted huge amounts of financial resources to strengthen their healthcare infrastructure. They have tried to increase the coverage of social security measures such as insurance. They have announced greater credit and financial support to MSMEs. They have also come out with a number of fiscal and monetary policy initiatives in order to help their economies revive and help fund the expanded socio-economic welfare programs. Countries around the world have even taken note of how the pandemic and the lockdown have had a disproportionate impact on women. They have recognized the sudden increase in gender violence and domestic violence, and they have tried to take suitable measures in order to promote the welfare of women. And since the pandemic has breached the capacities of the public sector, it has pushed governments around the world to seek greater partnerships with the private sector in order to jointly mobilize their resources and fight the pandemic, and as well as combat the socio-economic challenges that have been brought up by the pandemic. But all in all, there is no doubt that the pandemic has derailed our march towards the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals of the UN, and hence the writers argue that if we are to achieve the SDG goals, then what we need is a complete revolution in our policy mindset. The writers are asking governments around the world to adopt a more inclusive approach towards governance, and they are asking them to make their key institutions more resilient through appropriate reforms in order to enable the key institutions to adapt to any future shocks on the scale of the COVID-19 pandemic. They are asking the governments to adopt a universal approach towards social protection, and they are asking them to provide for universal coverage in their food security schemes, in their insurance programs, education and healthcare, in order to ensure complete social protection for the weaker sections. Then moreover, governments, especially that of developing countries, need to push towards a greener and more sustainable future in order to tackle the combined effects of climate change and the COVID-19 pandemic on the weaker and vulnerable sections. Now let's move on to the practice questions for today. Which river flows through the city of Nagpur? The correct answer is option B, the Nag River. See, the Mula-Muta River flows through the city of Pune, whereas the Vrishbhavati River flows through Bangalore. But all the three rivers are facing similar environmental challenges and they have been severely threatened by water pollution, which is a result of unplanned and unsustainable urbanization and industrialization seen in these three cities. This question has been asked because according to this article on page number 5, the Nagpur bench of the Bombay High Court has taken note of the excessive pollution of the Nag River as a result of industrialization and urbanization. Now let's take up the next question. Which of the following statements are correct? The International Development Association (IDA) is an international financial institution which offers concessional loans and grants to the world's poorest developing countries. The IDA is a member of the World Bank Group and is headquartered in Washington, D.C. Both the statements are correct. Option C is the right answer. This question has been asked because the 50 years ago article from page number 7 makes a reference to the IDA and how India can stand to benefit through its soft loans. Now let's take up the next question. Which of the following statements are correct? In India, the manufacture, import, research and release of genetically engineered organisms as well as products made by the use of such organisms are governed by a set of rules notified under the Environment Protection Act 1986. The Review Committee on Genetic Manipulation or RCGM, established under the Ministry of Science and Technology, monitors the safety of ongoing research projects and activities involving genetically engineered organisms. Both the statements are correct. Option C is the right answer. See, genetically engineered organisms pose a threat to biosafety. So since their manufacture, import, research and release are hazardous in nature, these activities are regulated under a set of rules that have been notified by the Environment Ministry under the Environment Protection Act of 1986. Then under the Ministry of Science and Technology, the Review Committee on Genetic Manipulation has been set up in order to monitor the safety of ongoing research projects involving genetically engineered organisms. This question has been asked because according to this article on page number 10, the Review Committee on Genetic Manipulation under the Department of Biotechnology and the Central Drug Safety Control Organization under the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare, they are looking to fast track the grant of approvals and trials for imported vaccines for COVID-19. That is, vaccines which have already proven their safety and efficacy through trials conducted in other countries. They would be fast tracked in order to speed up their adoption in India and help tackle the COVID-19 pandemic. Now let's take up the next question. Which of the following are viral infections or diseases? CMV infection, chlamydia, dengue fever. The correct answer is option D, 1 and 3 only. See, the CMV infection or the cytomegalovirus infection is a common herpes infection that affects human beings as well. This virus is spread through sexual and non-sexual contact with body secretions, whereas chlamydia is a sexually transmitted infection caused by a bacteria known as Chlamydia trachomatis. Then of course, dengue fever is a mosquito-borne tropical disease caused by the dengue virus. This question has been asked because according to this article on page number 10, Prime Minister Modi will inaugurate 3 COVID-19 testing facilities which will have a high throughput and turnaround capacity which will enable them to test over 10,000 samples in a single day. These testing labs that are being inaugurated at Noida, Mumbai and Kolkata are not only capable for testing for COVID-19, but they will also test for other diseases such as hepatitis B, HIV, tuberculosis, CMV infection, chlamydia, dengue, etc. Now let's take up the next practice question. Itolizumab, an antibody drug often in news, is meant for treating psoriasis. Option A is the right answer. See, this drug developed by Biocon has been in news because recently it was approved by the ICMR for treating COVID-19 patients in emergency cases. This antibody drug is primarily used to treat autoimmune conditions such as psoriasis. But since COVID-19 has also triggered an autoimmune response in few cases, and since a number of patients have died due to a cytokine storm, which sends our immune system into an overdrive and targets even healthy tissues and organs such as the lungs. So in such emergency cases, the usage of itolizumab was approved by the ICMR, but its efficacy was always under doubt. Now a COVID-19 task force set up by the ICMR has disapproved the usage of itolizumab because there is no strong scientific evidence available to prove the efficacy of the drug against COVID-19. Now let's take up the next question. Consider the following statements with regard to vitamin C. It is also called as ascorbic acid. It is a water-soluble vitamin that helps improve immunity. It aids in the synthesis of collagen and production of certain neurotransmitters. It is not stored in the body and requires daily intake. Select the correct statements from the quote below. All the 4 statements are correct, so option D is the right answer. This question has been asked because on page number 12, The Hindu carries an article explaining the significance of vitamin C in strengthening our immune system. This article has been published because doctors around the world are putting COVID-19 patients on a regimen of vitamin C in order to strengthen their immune response. Now let's take up the next question. Which of the following statements are correct? Poseidon drone is an underwater unmanned drone capable of carrying nuclear weapons being developed by the United States. Zircon is a hypersonic cruise missile that is being jointly developed by India and Israel. Both the statements are incorrect. Option D is the right answer. See, the Poseidon drone is an unmanned underwater drone that is capable of carrying nuclear weapons. And Zircon is a hypersonic cruise missile. But these new age weapons are being developed by Russia in order to introduce new strategic weapons into its arsenal. Now let's take up the next question. Which of the following statements are correct? The Istanbul Convention is a human rights treaty that deals with violence against women and domestic violence. The convention was signed in 2014 by all the members of the UN General Assembly. Amongst the given statements, the second statement is incorrect, so option A is the right answer. See, the Istanbul Convention deals with violence against women and domestic violence, but it was signed in 2011 by the Council of Europe, which is one of the principal organs of the European Union. This convention came into force in 2014, and it mandates the European Union members to promote gender rights and counter violence against women and domestic violence. This question has been asked because according to this article on page number 14, Poland is looking to quit the Istanbul Convention. Recently, Poland elected a right-wing conservative government which is opposed to gender equality, and on the basis of ideological and religious grounds, Poland has stated that it is unable to fulfill its obligations to the Istanbul Convention, and hence Poland is looking to quit the convention. Now let's take up a practice question from the 2015 prelims paper. Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action, often seen in news, is an agenda for women's empowerment, an outcome of a world conference convened by the United Nations. Option C is the right answer. Finally, let's take up a couple of mains practice questions. The first question: in criminal contempt of court cases, it is regrettable that judges believe that silencing criticism will harbor respect for the judiciary. Examine. The second question: governors should not act at the behest of the party ruling at the center. Discuss. Kindly write an answer to these questions and post your answers in the comment section below. So this concludes our discussion for the day. Thanks for watching.